Here as a PhD student in the history department. So broadly speaking, I examined black education in North Carolina during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, 1861 to 1876. So for those of you who are not familiar with Reconstruction, it was essentially the time period during and after the Civil War in which the federal government attempted to restructure the former Confederate states. Excuse me. Specifically, I look at how formerly enslaved people gained access to education in North Carolina during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. And I do that by examining the work of the teachers who worked in the first black schools. Essentially, three groups of teachers worked in North Carolina's black schools: Northern white, Southern white, and black people from the North and South. Yet, the prevailing interpretation of post-Civil War Southern black schooling is clouded by the misconception that the teachers of the free people were predominantly Northern white women. As one historian wrote, the Freedmen's teacher is one of the most persistently stereotyped Americans of the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Thus, this paper attempts to deconstruct the dominant narrative of Northern white teachers in Southern black schools by highlighting the significant role that black and Southern white teachers played in the construction of Freedmen's education. So throughout the course of this paper, I will refer to both the schools and the teachers as either Freedmen's teachers or teachers of the free people, and the same goes for the schools. But before I discuss the overarching findings of this research project, I'm going to give you a brief overview of black education during the Antebellum period so that you can situate this research project within the historical context. I'm also going to talk briefly about the historical literature because this is essentially a revisionist study. I'm going to talk about one of the sources that was particularly useful for the completion of this research project, and because this is the Institute for Irish Studies, I'm also going to talk about the Irish connection. So prior to the American Civil War, almost every state of the slaveholding South had outlawed the literacy instruction of slaves. This was primarily done in an effort to curb slave unrest. Following the Stono Rebellion of 1739, an uprising that resulted in the deaths of more than 20 whites, South Carolina passed the first anti-literacy law, which made it a crime to teach slaves to read or write. Subsequent anti-literacy laws, particularly during the 1830s, were incited by the 1829 publication of David Walker's anti-slavery pamphlet, Appeal to the Coloured Citizens of the World, as well as Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion of 1831. So here you can see a woodcut of the massacre in Virginia. I think an estimated 60 whites were killed during this massacre, although some historians have suggested that that figure may be slightly exaggerated. And then on the right you have David Walker's anti-slavery pamphlet. Walker was actually a free black man from the coastal town of Wilmington in North Carolina, and this pamphlet called for slaves to rise up against the institution of slavery, and it particularly highlighted the role that education, or a lack thereof, was how a lack of education was used to oppress black people. And so it was viewed as particularly inflammatory, and Southern whites really attempted to make sure that it wasn't being disseminated widely, or as widely as it was. So essentially, Southern lawmakers prohibited slave education because they feared that educated slaves would become dissatisfied with their subjugated status and attempt to overthrow the institution of slavery. In 1831, North Carolina introduced its anti-literacy law, and as you can see, it read, "Whereas the teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion to the manifest injury of the citizens of the state, any free person who shall hereafter teach or attempt to teach any slave within the state to read or write, the use of figures excepted, shall be liable to indictment in any court of record in the state having jurisdiction thereof." Some southern states also prohibited the education of free blacks. In 1800, South Carolina revised its anti-literacy law of 1740 to prohibit the education of both slaves and free blacks. This was done because the original statute had proved insufficient at preventing enterprising blacks from conducting or attending clandestine schools. Although some slaveholding states did not impose bans upon black literacy, public opinion was nonetheless opposed to black education. So North Carolina did not actually enforce any sort of legislation against education for free black people, but white people were nonetheless opposed to it, and the free black people encountered a lot of resistance when they attempted to establish or conduct a school. That being said, in 1850, in the census, 217 free blacks were reportedly attending school at that time, so it was possibly in areas where it was not opposed to as much. So North Carolina is quite a large state, and the level of opposition varied from place to place, depending on things like if it was a black majority or white majority area, and how strictly they could enforce these laws. In spite of the anti-literacy laws, some black slaves succeeded in acquiring a degree of literacy, and at the onset of the American Civil War, an estimated 10% of the enslaved population could read or write. Most of the slaves in North Carolina acquired literacy through surreptitious means. As ex-slave Coleman Freeman observed, quote, "If we got learning, we stole it." Some slaves learned to read and write by eavesdropping, a skill perfected by many enslaved people during the Civil War. John Stella Martin, for instance, formerly enslaved in North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, learned to read and write by watching his playmates complete their homework. So he reflected on his learning experiences in 1867, and he wrote, "But though the white boys would not teach me, they could not control or prevent the acquisition of a quick and retentive memory with which I was blessed. And by their bantering one another at spelling, and betting each on his proficiency over the other, I learned to spell by sound before I knew by sight a single letter of the alphabet." In some instances, slaves were secretly taught by members of the white community, and at times by their own masters or mistresses, although this was generally uncommon. Although other slaves were taught by members of the free black community. However, most slave states enacted serious penalties for those who were caught engaging in slave education, so for those who were caught either teaching or learning. Thus, although some slaves succeeded in acquiring a degree of literacy, most of North Carolina's enslaved population never learned to read or write. Few even attempted to gain access to schooling, simply because those who were caught were often severely punished. Once a slave became somewhat proficient in either reading or writing, they passed their knowledge on to other members of the slave community. In this way, enslaved blacks used literacy as a symbol of resistance. This tradition continued during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. As one teacher in New Bern, North Carolina wrote, and she wrote this during the Civil War period, "It is a fact which everyone observes, that the freedman no sooner learns even the first letter of the alphabet than he is teaching them to his fellows. A little boy, the youngest in New Bern, who had partially mastered a few letters, was seen in the street pointing a group of boys to the letter T, the initial of a signboard, and his pupils seemed to be learning from him as thoroughly as if he had been a college professor." So as soon as the Civil War began in 1861, formerly enslaved men and women demanded access to education, and on the grassroots level, free people throughout North Carolina built schoolhouses, hired teachers, and purchased textbooks. Although North Carolina's enslaved population was not legally freed until Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, many slaves self-emancipated at the outbreak of war by fleeing to Union-occupied areas of the state. So in 1862, the eastern region of North Carolina came under Union control, and slaves from all around the state flocked to Union lines. Some travelled over 300 miles to escape slavery. That being said, because of the rural nature of the South in general and North Carolina specifically, as late as 1865, some slaves still were not aware that they were free. So throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction period, slaves emerged from bondage at different stages. As the Civil War and Reconstruction era progressed, formerly enslaved men and women politically organised to ensure greater access to education. In 1865, for instance, 117 black men from 42 different counties gathered in the state's capital of Raleigh to open the first Freedmen's Convention of the South. A second convention was held the following year at the same location. At these conventions, black delegates asked for friendly relations with whites, increased access to education, equal employment opportunities, and, quote, to have all the oppressive laws which make unjust discriminations on account of race or colour wiped from the statutes of the state. These actions ultimately inspired northern white men and women to engage in freedmen's education, and aid and missionary societies were established throughout the northern states of America to aid the establishment of freedmen schools. Some of these societies were secular, while others were religious, and most, but not all, were established at the onset of the Civil War to aid the free people's transition from slavery to freedom. Although these aid and missionary societies provided many useful tasks, such as collecting and dispatching donations of aid to the South, one of their most important roles lay in the provision of schooling. From as early as 1862, organisations such as the American Missionary Association, the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, and the Friends Freedmen's Association established schools in North Carolina and hired teachers to work in them. So this is a table of all of the Freedmen's Aid Societies that operated in North Carolina between 1862 and 1876. You have the religious aid societies on the left and the secular on the right. Although both organisations were focused upon teaching the free people the rudiments of reading, writing and simple math, as well as religious and moral values, the religious societies, as you can probably imagine, were focused on gaining converts. So that was sort of the fundamental difference between the two of them. The American Missionary Association, you can see third down on this side, that was probably the most prominent aid society in North Carolina and throughout the American South around this time. And they sponsored most of the northern white teachers. Southern white teachers and black teachers rarely were employed by one of these societies, and instead they worked in independent schools that were supported by private tuition fees or some aid for the Freedmen's Bureau, which I'll talk about in a minute. Levi Coffin, a white native of North Carolina, helped to establish the Western Freedmen's Aid Commission, so it's the secular one at the very bottom of the table, while he was living in Cincinnati, Ohio. Although Southern whites were generally opposed to black education or otherwise aiding the free people, Coffin was a Quaker, and due to their witness against slavery, North Carolina Quakers had exhibited a deep commitment to black education since the mid-18th century. And Coffin actually established a school for enslaved people in North Carolina during the mid-1800s, I think about 1850, with the permission of the slaves' owners, who were perceived as more lenient than the others. However, he was forced to shut the school down because neighbouring slaveholders argued that it would make those slaves become dissatisfied and unhappy. So in order to solicit aid and donations, Coffin went on a year-long trip around Europe, and he succeeded in establishing Freedmen's Aid Societies in London, Dublin, Belfast and Glasgow. These aid societies would continue donating aid and resources to the free people once Coffin returned from his journey. Although northern white teachers were not alone in their efforts to educate former slaves, the teachers of the free people have been consistently portrayed as northern white women. Writing in 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois, or as I believe he preferred to be called Du Bois, was one of the first historians to offer a description of the freedman's teacher. He wrote, "Behind the mists of ruin and rapine waved the calico dresses of women who dared. Rich and poor they were, serious and curious. Bereaved now of a father, now of a brother, now of more than these, they came seeking a life work in planting New England schoolhouses among the white and black of the South." Although this description served to reinforce the idea that the teachers of the free people were predominantly young, white New England females, Du Bois' glowing interpretation of the teachers was overshadowed by the so-called Dunning School, a group of Southern white historians which dominated Reconstruction scholarship for much of the 20th century. Regarding Reconstruction as a tragic era in which white Northerners attempted to exploit the defeated South for their own personal gain, historians associated with the Dunning School were particularly aggrieved with the Northern white teachers, whom they perceived as committed to the ideals of social equality. Set against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, a new wave of revisionist scholarship emerged in the mid-20th century, and freedmen's education was hailed as a commendable success. Although the teachers of the free people continued to be portrayed as northern white women, or as James McPherson described them, an army of New England schoolmarms, their work was interpreted as an extension of the pre-war abolitionist movement and fueled by evangelicalism. As the 20th century moved into the 21st, a more critical interpretation of Reconstruction emerged. Described by Eric Foner as post-revisionism, historians of this persuasion perceive freedmen's education as profoundly conservative and ultimately a failure. The former slaves needed land, protection and a stake in society, argued Ronald E. Butchert in 1980. They needed and demanded meaningful power. They were given instead a school. Building upon the work of decades of historical revision, including some of his own work, Ronald Butcher's 2010 study of freedmen's education successfully challenged the stereotypical schoolmarm image And as I explained at the beginning of this paper, he argued that 3 distinct groups of teachers worked in southern black schools: northern white, southern white, and black people from the north and south. Interestingly, Butchert argued that most of the teachers between 1861 and 1876 were southern whites. So, Butchert's study is based upon the findings of a large-scale database known as the Freedmen's Teacher Project, which he himself compiled over the creation of several years of research. And I will refer to this database as the FTP going forward. This database essentially documents almost 12,000 teachers who worked in the entire southern region between 1861 and 1876. I have the North Carolina section of this database, and I've used this database to reconstruct the accepted image of the Freedmen's teacher in North Carolina. It identifies 1,419 teachers who taught the freed people in North Carolina between 1861 and 1876. So although complete data is not available for every teacher, it can provide their full name, gender, birth, religion, education, parents' occupation, occupation before and after teaching in the South, the sponsoring organisation, the location of the school in which they taught, and the years spent teaching in the South. For southern white teachers, the database may also indicate if they or their parents had been slaveholders, were immigrants, or were of northern extraction, because that might influence their reasons for engaging in the work. Unfortunately, the database doesn't reveal if a teacher was born in slavery. Although Butchert speculated that most of the southern black teachers were probably former slaves rather than freeborn, he admitted that there was no way of confirming this. He wrote, "It is often not possible to establish the slave or free status of African Americans. If they appear in the decennial census, they were most likely free. However, many free blacks avoided census takers, and census takers may not have bothered to enumerate free blacks. While slave schedules are also an extremely valuable source, they do not identify the name of slaves. So slaves were enumerated in the census, but their names weren't recorded. And the number of slaves in a particular homestead was recorded, as well as their ages, but that was it." So based upon the findings of this database, it is clear that northern white women did not dominate North Carolina schools for the free people. On the contrary, most of the Freedmen's teachers were black, 705 to be exact. 523 teachers were white, and the race of 191 is unknown. So already you can see, just from that graph alone, which depicts the teacher's race, that this myth of the Yankee schoolmarm is completely unfounded, because black teachers were in the significant majority. 705 were identified as black. Robert G. Fitzgerald, a native of Pennsylvania, and James Edward O'Hara of New York were 2 prominent black teachers in North Carolina. And as you can probably tell by their surnames, they both had Irish connections. In 1866, Fitzgerald began teaching the free people in Virginia, and he continued educating freedmen and women throughout North Carolina until the close of Reconstruction in 1877. Indeed, the FDP indicates that he continued teaching beyond 1877, although the corresponding data for those dates are not available. According to the Fitzgerald family myth, Robert's grandfather was an earl from County Kildare. As Pauline Murray, Robert's granddaughter, wrote of her great-grandfather, the earl's reputed son, "How much of this claim was fact and how much fancy is unknown, but his children were nurtured upon this legend. It started something of a tradition in our family. Grandfather Robert took it very seriously. I heard it all the time at home, and knew anyone of Fitzgerald blood was expected to act under all circumstances with dignity and courage befitting the name he bore." So the Fitzgerald family were very, very proud of their Irish ancestry, and Pauline Murray, she was a civil rights activist, and although she was equally proud of her Irish ancestry, she felt that her family neglected their African ancestry because of it. So there was she was kind of disappointed in that regard. But they were very proud of their Irish ancestry, and particularly the spirit of rebellion that Ireland was associated with at that time. James O'Hara's ancestry was not quite as colourful, although he led a remarkable career in education, law and politics during the post-war period. Born to an Irish-American father and West Indian mother in New York, O'Hara began teaching the free people in New Bern, North Carolina in 1863. After teaching the free people for a total of 5 years, O'Hara moved to Washington, D.C. to study at Howard University, a private black institution established after the Civil War. When he returned to North Carolina, O'Hara quickly became active in local politics. In 1868, he helped draft North Carolina's new state constitution, which was necessary in order for North Carolina to be readmitted to the Union. And between 1868 and 1869, he served in the State House of Representatives. In 1883, O'Hara was the second black man to be elected to Congress from North Carolina. Throughout his active career in politics, O'Hara was dedicated to promoting black civil rights, and he succeeded in briefly ending segregation on interstate steam trains. So, if you're familiar with American history, during this Reconstruction period, black and white people for a very short time lived in a sort of biracial community where all of the facilities that were denied to slaves suddenly were made available to these freed people, and particularly when federal forces were still in the South. However, when federal forces were removed from the South in 1877, Southern legislators enacted discriminatory laws known as Jim Crow laws, and that's where you have sort of where segregation is reintroduced into the Southern United States. After serving in Congress for 4 years, O'Hara returned to North Carolina to practice law with his son. Across the entire group of teachers, men and women taught in almost equal numbers. So again, we're dispelling this myth of the Yankee schoolmarm image. Between 1861 and 1876, 720 men taught the free people compared to 666 women, and the gender for 33 teachers is unknown. Admittedly, there were variations in gender participation across regional and racial lines. For instance, northern white women taught more frequently than northern white men, northern black men and women taught in virtually equal numbers, and southern men, whether they were black or white, taught more frequently than southern women. This was partly because teaching in a black school was not considered to be a respectable position for southern white women, but also because teaching the freed people was a precarious position at best, and black women were compelled to find employment that offered a steady source of income, such as domestic work. So Freedmen's teaching wasn't really well paid at all. It was funded by a combination of benevolent and federal funding, and that was sort of precarious at best. So black women needed to find a steady source of income, and domestic work offered that source of income. The home is known for each of the 1,419 teachers. Contrary to previous historical interpretations, most of the teachers did not come from New England. In fact, numbering 868, most of the teachers came from a southern or slaveholding state, including the border states of Delaware and Maryland, as well as the slaveholding District of Columbia. Tellingly, 812 of these teachers came from North Carolina. So you can see from the graph that most of the teachers came from the South, and most of those southern teachers came from North Carolina. Almost 40% of the teachers, 534 to be exact, came from the North, while 17 others came from countries outside of the US, including the Bahamas, Canada, England, Ireland, and the West Indies. Admittedly, most of the teachers who have been identified as Northern whites came from the New England states of Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont, so the Yankee schoolmarm epithet is not entirely unfounded. A Presbyterian woman named Mary Kildare from Newry in County Down was the only teacher who came from Ireland. Between 1867 and 1875, Kildare taught freedmen and women across 3 southern states, one of which was North Carolina. Described as a well-liked teacher, Kildare was fully committed to the missionary cause, and in 1873 she wrote to the American Missionary Association, her sponsoring organization, quote, "Though I have discovered the full meaning of 2 words, fatigue and hunger, I am not weary of it. I used to think it would be impossible to enjoy the work more than I did, but this, I am sure, is perfect enjoyment." End quote. After teaching the free people for a total of 8 years, Kildare served as a missionary in the Congo with the Methodist Episcopal Church. In her analysis of Georgia's post-war black schools, Jacqueline Jones claimed that most of the teachers were young, well-educated, unmarried women from middle-class northern homes. Although this description more or less serves the northern white teaching cohort, it cannot be applied to the entire group of teachers who worked in North Carolina schools for the free people. Not surprisingly, few of the black teachers, particularly the southern black teachers, could claim any wealth during the early days of freedom, and many were as destitute as their students. Former slave Lucy Brown, for instance, revealed that she took up teaching to, quote, "support and educate my little ones." However, Brown could not afford to continue running a school because she could not because she could not find employment with an aid or missionary society and her students were too poor to pay the tuition fees. Thus, during the spring of 1868, Brown pleaded with the Freedmen's Bureau for assistance in paying the rent of her school building. She wrote, "Reverend Sir, if you can assist the fatherless in any way, please do it." Brown did not resume teaching the following year, so it is unlikely that the aid she did receive from the Bureau, if any, was enough to support her work in the Freedmen's School. So I mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau there, and just to explain, that was a federal agency established by Congress in 1865 to aid the free people's transition from slavery to freedom. However, due to a lack of funding and a lack of manpower, the Bureau's operations were heavily circumscribed. In terms of education, if and when the funds were available, the Bureau could pay for the teachers' transportation to and from the south, as well as the rent of the school building, which is what former slave Lucy Brown was looking for. It could also provide financial assistance for the establishment of black colleges only. The Bureau could not, however, hire teachers or pay their salary. In North Carolina, the Education Division of the Freedmen's Bureau was under the control and management of two successive superintendents of education, F.A. Fisk and H.C. Vogel. Although both agents were committed to growing and sustaining a system of black schooling, financial limitations and volatile race relations ultimately meant that when the Bureau finally closed its door in 1870, less than half of the black school-age children in the state had succeeded in gaining access to education. Like their black counterparts, few southern white teachers were members of the middle class. Although some wealthy planters claimed to support black education, primarily because they perceived it as a means of social control, those who engaged in freedmen's education generally came from the lower classes. In North Carolina, several of the teachers were non-slaveholding farmers prior to the Civil War, and it is likely that the post-war agricultural disasters drove these men into freedmen's schools. Noah Hancock, for instance, was a non-slaveholding farmer from Asheboro in North Carolina when the Civil War broke out in 1861. At this time, Hancock was worth a total of $375. At age 30, Hancock enlisted into the Confederate Army as a private in Company F of North Carolina's 46th Infantry Regiment. After teaching the free people for 1 year in 1867, Hancock returned to work on the farm, and by 1870 he was still struggling to make ends meet and was worth just $170. And if you look at the length of time that these teachers spent in the school, it also illustrates their lack of commitment to black education. Generally, those who had been farmers before the war spent maximum of 1 year in freedmen's schools. Few spent any longer than that teaching the free people. Finally, an analysis of the FTP repudiates the off-cited claim that the teachers of the free people were neo-abolitionists bent on extending and securing the boundaries of black freedom. Only 23 teachers have been positively identified as pre-war abolitionists, while there is evidence to suggest that 10 other white teachers may have been active in abolitionism. All black teachers, however, are included in the database as showing evidence of abolitionism. Arguably, the remaining northern white teachers were anti-slavery. However, an opposition to slavery did not necessarily equate to a belief in racial equality. Margaret Newbold Thorpe, a native of Salem, New Jersey, best illustrates this point. While stationed in Warrenton, North Carolina, Thorpe and her teaching companion were compelled to board with a black family because local whites refused to provide the new teachers with living quarters. In spite of her obvious racial biases, Thorpe was not overly displeased with this arrangement, most likely because her hosts were more than willing to wait upon the two women. Reflecting upon a visit from an Episcopalian clergyman, Thorpe wrote, quote, "Mr. Marshall called today while we were at dinner, and we were glad for him to see that we ate alone, with a man waiter, as the white people are under the impression that we live with Uncle Albert and his family as one family, not with him as servants." Evidently, Thorpe was content to live with black people providing they respected the pre-war racial hierarchy. On another occasion, Thorpe attended a black wedding, and she was particularly pleased that the other black guests never annoyed her with, quote, "the slightest attempt at social equality." Ultimately, an analysis of the FTP illustrates that northern white women did not dominate North Carolina's black schools during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. On the contrary, the real heroes of this narrative were the black men and women who engaged in freedmen's education to elevate their race. Indeed, used in conjunction with traditional archival sources, such as the teachers' letters, memoirs, and diaries, the FTP demonstrates that black teachers were the driving force behind the growth and development of southern black schools beyond the immediate wartime period. Although black educators began teaching later than their northern white counterparts and in fewer numbers, most likely because of their low levels of literacy, the number of black teachers increased throughout the Reconstruction period, while the number of white teachers declined. So here you can see a graph of the teachers' tenure. So green is for the black teachers, blue is for the northern white, and yellow is for the southern white. As you can see, black teachers, although they began teaching later than the northern white and in some cases southern white, they continued teaching and they taught in much greater numbers. So even though we've always known that black people demanded access to education when the Civil War broke out by attempting to build schools or hire teachers, we now know that this agency continued throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Indeed, it continued beyond 1877. So it was just one of the ways in which black people mobilised during the Civil War and Reconstruction period just to gain increased access to education. So thus, while black agency has long been recognised during the early stages of southern black schooling by documenting the numerous ways in which the black community organised politically to ensure greater access to education, this research project argues that black mobilisation was instrumental to the growth and development of freedmen's education beyond the early days of freedom. Thank you.
That's great, AnneMarie. Thanks very much. There's enough historians here, I think, to ask questions, and other people are allowed to ask questions too, but off you go.
Actually, it's probably an irrelevant question, but sure, why not? When you were showing us the religious schools there, AnneMarie, they're obviously Presbyterian, and again, this is my ignorance, so I'm an honest historian. The Caroline States, weren't they originally French? They were, presumably.